At 11:45 in the morning, a mother drove slowly down a desolate stretch of Highway 47 searching for a neon pink bicycle that had seemingly vanished into the thin desert air. This was the exact route her daughter took every single day without fail. The asphalt was empty. The silence of the Rio Grande Valley offered no clues. A 19-year-old woman was gone, leaving behind a chilling void. The missing woman was Tara. She operated her life on a strict, unyielding schedule. Every morning she rode her bicycle precisely 36 miles. She traced the exact same path south from her home, turned around at the railroad tracks, and pedaled back. This rigid routine was a heavily monitored system. It dictated her departure times, her physical pacing, and her exact whereabouts down to the minute. On September 20th, she left her house at 9:30 in the morning. She explicitly told her mother to come looking for her if she was not home by noon. She had a tennis match scheduled for 12:30 in the afternoon. The timeline for her return was incredibly tight. Investigators later mapped this strict window to establish the exact parameters of her mysterious disappearance. When noon passed without her return, her mother immediately retraced the bicycle route. She drove south along the highway, scanning the gravel shoulders for any sign of neon pink. She found absolutely nothing on the initial pass. Law enforcement was contacted shortly after. Deputies began documenting the roadside, meticulously looking for any physical disturbance in the dirt or signs of a struggle. The immediate result of this broken timeline was a localized panic. The Calico family knew this absence was fundamentally wrong. Tara would never miss a scheduled commitment without calling home first. The failure to return triggered an immediate escalation from a routine delay to a highly suspected abduction. The local authorities recognized the severity of the deviation from her established routine. Physical fragments soon materialized along the dusty highway shoulder. Searchers located a shattered cassette tape belonging to the band Boston. Pieces of a plastic Walkman lay scattered in the dirt nearby. Bicycle tire tracks indicated a sudden, violent swerve off the pavement. These scattered components proved that an interception had occurred. She had not simply ridden away by her own choice. The realization of foul play crushed the family with an unimaginable weight. Patty Dole, her mother, faced the agonizing burden of that missed noon deadline. She had known instantly that something catastrophic had happened on that road. Every passing hour magnified the dread. The safety of their daily lives had been permanently ruptured by a threat they could not see. A suffocating helplessness settled over the search parties. Volunteers walked the highway with a growing sense of despair. The vastness of the landscape actively mocked their efforts. They were looking for a bright pink bicycle, yet the desert yielded nothing but dust and scrub brush. The psychological toll of finding only broken plastic on the roadside was devastating for everyone involved. The search area expanded rapidly outward from that isolated stretch of road. The investigation moved from the immediate family circle into the broader geography of the surrounding region. Law enforcement had to meticulously map the entire area. They needed to fully understand the environment where the abduction took place in order to predict where a suspect might have fled. This meant shifting the focus to the town itself. The community was small, tightly knit, and completely unaccustomed to violent mysteries. The local geography essentially became the primary suspect. Every dirt road, every abandoned structure, and every irrigation ditch required intense scrutiny. The investigators had to look at their own backyards through the lens of a severe criminal act. The town of Belen sits in the high desert of the American Southwest. It is defined by long, straight highways cutting through arid, sun-baked brush. The population is sparse, and the distances between homes are substantial. The landscape is flat, highly exposed, and entirely unforgiving to anyone caught outside without adequate shelter. It is a place where secrets can easily be buried. Highway 47 runs parallel to the winding Rio Grande River. It is bordered by deep drainage ditches and dense thickets of old cottonwood trees. Beyond the immediate river valley, the terrain shifts abruptly to barren mesas. It is a harsh environment that can easily conceal physical evidence. The relentless desert wind quickly erases footprints, tire tracks, and any sign of human passage. The jurisdiction fell to the local authorities in New Mexico. The investigative framework of the state police at the time relied heavily on manual coordination and physical paperwork. This was the standard protocol for the era. Missing persons cases were handled through localized teletype messages and physical bulletin boards. The state lacked a centralized rapid response digital database to instantly connect distant police departments. Information traveled incredibly slowly across county lines. Detectives had to physically drive to neighboring jurisdictions to share case files. The system required manual sorting of handwritten witness statements and tip logs. Cross-referencing a suspicious vehicle meant digging through paper records at the Department of Motor Vehicles. It was a sluggish, paper-bound mechanism that severely hampered the speed of the critical early investigation. Despite these severe constraints, the physical search was massive in scale. State police deployed helicopters to visually scan the mesas from the air. Tracking dogs were brought directly to the highway shoulder where the cassette tape was found. Teams on horseback rode through the dense brush along the riverbanks. They established a rigid grid system to ensure absolutely no area was overlooked. Detectives systematically interviewed residents living along the highway corridor. They carefully collected fragments of witness memory. Multiple people reported seeing a light-colored 1953 Ford pickup truck with a camper shell. It had been driving unusually closely behind the bicycle. Investigators logged these specific sightings, prioritizing the vintage truck as the primary suspect vehicle in the critical early days of the search. As the autumn of 1988 progressed, the momentum of the search inevitably slowed down. The extensive grid searches produced absolutely no further physical evidence. The suspect truck was never located by authorities. The immediate consequence of this stalled investigation was a chilling silence. The case files grew thick with dead ends, and the most promising leads fundamentally disintegrated over time. The year ended with a profound and agonizing lack of answers. The local police had effectively exhausted their physical resources. The failure to locate the missing woman or her bicycle created a permanent scar on the small community. The investigation slowly transitioned into a cold case, waiting dormant in the archives for a spark that would eventually ignite a massive global mystery. Patty Dole, Tara Calico's mother, refused to accept the silence that settled over the final months of 1988. She transformed her home into a meticulous command center for the search. Every ringing telephone brought a sudden surge of agonizing hope. The holiday season arrived, magnifying the devastating absence at the family table and deepening the emotional void. Neighbors who once left their doors unlocked began securing heavy deadbolts as dusk fell. The lingering uncertainty of 1988 bred a quiet paranoia throughout the local neighborhoods. Parents strictly prohibited their children from riding bicycles along the rural highway corridors. A profound sense of vulnerability replaced the previously idyllic atmosphere of the desert town. The parameters of the disappearance required a fundamentally new approach as weeks turned into months. Local authorities in New Mexico recognized that the answers likely existed far beyond the immediate geography of Valencia County. The search parameters expanded significantly across multiple state lines. Investigators began distributing detailed flyers through national missing persons networks. This deliberate shift from an active rescue operation to a long-term investigation altered the daily workflow. Detectives transitioned from walking physical grid lines to managing vast databases of unverified tips. The disappearance was no longer just a localized tragedy. It had become a complex puzzle requiring federal coordination and unprecedented public outreach. The physical landscape surrounding the disappearance route was vast and unforgiving. Thousands of acres of arid scrubland bordered the paved roads. Deep arroyos and abandoned structures dotted the desolate stretches of the high desert. This rugged terrain offered countless obscure places to conceal evidence from even the most meticulous search teams. Posters bearing Tara's face began to weather and fade on community bulletin boards across the American Southwest. The stark black and white images became permanent fixtures in gas stations and remote highway rest stops. These physical markers mapped the expanding radius of the active case. They stood as silent sentinels against the encroaching reality of a stagnant investigation. Then, on June 15, 1989, a startling discovery fundamentally altered the trajectory of the investigation. A woman in Port St. Joe, Florida, noticed a discarded photograph in the parking lot of a convenience store. It was a Polaroid picture lying face down on the asphalt. The image had been exposed to the harsh Florida sun, yet the subjects remained chillingly clear. The Polaroid captured a terrifying scene of a young woman and a boy bound and gagged inside a dimly lit space. They appeared to be confined in the back of a windowless van. The film type was analyzed by experts to determine its manufacturing date. This specific Polaroid film had only been available to the public since May of 1989. Forensic experts immediately seized the photograph to conduct exhaustive technical analyses. They scrutinized the minute details in the background, including a copy of a specific V.C. Andrews novel lying next to the girl. Investigators enhanced the image to examine a phone number partially visible on the spine of a book. They measured the shadows to estimate the exact time of day the flash was fired. The physical photograph entered the strict chain of custody required for critical evidence. Federal investigators distributed high-resolution copies of the Polaroid to police departments nationwide. They cross-referenced the chilling image against national databases of missing children. The woman who found the photo was interviewed extensively to establish a precise timeline of the parking lot's vehicle traffic. The emergence of this photo shattered the localized nature of the investigation. It forced law enforcement to consider a vast interstate abduction scenario. The Florida parking lot was located more than 1,500 miles away from the original crime scene. This massive geographic leap exponentially multiplied the logistical challenges facing the investigative teams. National media networks broadcast the chilling photo into millions of living rooms. The image generated a massive influx of thousands of new tips and alleged sightings. Police phone lines were completely overwhelmed by citizens trying to identify the victims or the van. This unprecedented exposure accelerated the investigation but simultaneously buried detectives under an avalanche of unverified data. For Patty Dowell, viewing the photo was an agonizing psychological ordeal. She stared at the bound girl, desperately searching for familiar physical markers. She noted a distinct scar on the girl's leg that matched one Tara had sustained in a severe car accident. The possibility that her daughter was enduring such terror inflicted a profound, inescapable trauma on the family. The photograph offered a cruel paradox of hope and horror. It suggested Tara might still be alive, but trapped in an unimaginable nightmare. The family was forced to publicly analyze their loved one's potential suffering on national television. This relentless exposure stripped away their privacy, leaving them emotionally raw and deeply vulnerable to the public's gaze. Despite the explosive global attention, the leads generated by the broadcast eventually began to fracture. The intense focus on the Florida parking lot failed to produce a suspect vehicle or a definitive identification. The investigation slowly fractured into competing theories. The terrifying momentum of the discovery gradually gave way to the quiet reality of an unsolved mystery. The federal task forces eventually scaled back their active involvement as actionable evidence evaporated. The physical case files were systematically reorganized and transferred to long-term storage units. The daily briefings ceased, replaced by sporadic updates and annual press conferences. The transition from an active hunt to a waiting game was a subtle, devastating bureaucratic shift. The unsolved case files now occupy linear feet of metal shelving in secure archive rooms. Hundreds of manila folders contain fading tip sheets and typed interview transcripts. The original Polaroid rests in a climate-controlled evidence locker, carefully shielded from light to prevent further degradation. Dust settles on the boxes that hold the fragmented narrative of a vanished life. Back in Belen, the physical locations associated with the disappearance remain largely unchanged. The highway where the bicycle was abandoned still stretches out toward the horizon, baking in the afternoon sun. The missing poster that centers on that haunting photograph still hangs in the local police station lobby. It serves as a permanent, silent monument to a cold case that refuses to be closed. The designation of a cold case represents a specific bureaucratic reclassification within law enforcement systems. When a missing persons investigation exhausts all active leads, the file changes jurisdiction internally. The daily allocation of manpower ceases. Detectives are reassigned to active, incoming crimes. The search for answers becomes entirely dependent on external catalysts. The physical evidence enters a state of indefinite preservation. Chain of custody protocols dictate that every item must be periodically audited. The original case files are digitized to prevent physical degradation. This means transferring thousands of pages into centralized databases. The system is designed for retention, not active pursuit. It waits for a system trigger, like a DNA match or a new witness. Standard procedure dictates an annual review of these dormant files. A specialized cold case detective will pull the boxes from the archive. They look for overlooked details or testable biological material. In 1988, forensic technology was fundamentally limited compared to modern standards. Investigators re-examine old interview transcripts to identify inconsistencies. They cross-reference the original suspect lists with newly convicted offenders in the national database. This review process is highly methodical. The detective creates a timeline matrix, mapping every known movement from the day of the disappearance. They evaluate the original forensic reports for any items that could now yield DNA. The process requires navigating decades of degraded memories and deceased witnesses. Every piece of paper is scrutinized for a missed connection. It is a slow, exhaustive audit of past investigative failures. The immediate consequence of this reclassification is a sharp drop in public visibility. Media outlets stop requesting daily briefings. The dedicated tip lines are disconnected and routed to general dispatch. Reward funds established by the community eventually expire or are returned to donors. The legal framework surrounding the investigation shifts from an active rescue mission to a historical inquiry. For the local police department, the unsolved status creates a permanent blemish on their clearance rates. Successive sheriffs inherit the unsolved file as a political liability. The community gradually replaces active searching with speculative rumors. Physical command posts are dismantled. The town attempts to return to a baseline of normalcy. The absence of resolution leaves a permanent fracture in the local social fabric. The psychological toll of an unresolved investigation is uniquely devastating for the families involved. Ambiguous loss prevents the natural grieving process from taking hold. Every unidentified body found in the desert triggers a fresh wave of panic and dread. The family remains trapped in a perpetual state of 1988. They cannot move forward, anchored entirely to the day the timeline stopped. Hope becomes a punishing, relentless burden. Birthdays and anniversaries mutate into grim milestones. The family home transforms into a makeshift command center frozen in time. Parents often exhaust their life savings funding private investigators. They endure the agonizing silence of a phone that never rings with answers. The lack of a definitive conclusion breeds an isolating paranoia. The people closest to the tragedy are forced to suspect everyone they meet, yet this specific investigation refused to fade completely into the archival dust. The narrative repeatedly centers on a single piece of anomalous evidence. This focal point forces the case back into the international spotlight every few years. It prevents the complete closure that typically accompanies a long-term disappearance. The focus shifts from the empty highways of New Mexico to a broader, more terrifying possibility. The investigation pivots entirely on one captured moment in time. The evidence that centers the public fascination is entirely divorced from the original crime scene. It introduces a geographic leap that confounds standard investigative models. The narrative moves from a localized search to a sprawling multi-state puzzle. This shift fundamentally alters the scale of the mystery. It is no longer just a small-town tragedy. It becomes a widely debated national spectacle. The media landscape that centers on this mystery is a chaotic environment. True crime forums and amateur sleuth networks dissect the available data endlessly. Digital bulletin boards are plastered with enhanced images and contrasting theories. The physical environment of the investigation expands to include television studios and specialized forensic labs. The quiet desert town is replaced by the noisy, relentless churn of national news cycles. The case exists in a digital ecosystem of perpetual analysis. Within the police department, the physical space dedicated to the investigation changes. The focus centers on a specific bulletin board in the cold case unit. It is dominated by blown-up, high-resolution scans of the crucial evidence. Maps with pushpins stretch across the United States, tracing unverified sightings. The sterile fluorescent lighting of the precinct illuminates decades of accumulated theories. The room is a physical manifestation of an expanding, unresolved puzzle. The victim profile for Tara remains the foundational document. The National Crime Information Center database maintains her specific biological identifiers. This system automatically cross-references her dental records with any unidentified remains entered nationally. The algorithm operates continuously, scanning thousands of entries without human intervention. It is a silent, automated search grid. The system ensures that her biometric data is never truly forgotten. The Missing Persons Clearinghouse system dictates how her information is distributed to other agencies. When a potential lead emerges in another state, a formal protocol is triggered. Interstate requests for assistance are routed through the Federal Bureau of Investigation. This bureaucratic network ensures that local jurisdictions can access federal resources. The system is designed to bridge the gap between isolated police departments. It creates a unified national net to catch transient evidence. Investigators routinely update her specific case file with new forensic methodologies. They meticulously catalog the exact make and model of the missing bicycle. The Walkman's serial number is broadcast to pawn shop databases nationwide. Every piece of property associated with her morning ride is entered into the stolen goods registry. Detectives periodically re-interview original witnesses using modern cognitive interview techniques. They attempt to bypass decades of memory decay to extract a single new detail. The procedure for evaluating new tips about her whereabouts is strictly standardized. An intake officer logs the caller's information and assigns a priority level. Low-priority sightings are filed for future reference. High-priority leads, especially those involving physical evidence, trigger immediate deployment of field agents. The investigators must establish a chain of custody for any new item submitted by the public. Every step is documented to ensure admissibility in a potential future trial. The enduring consequence for the Calico family was a life permanently altered by public scrutiny. They were forced into the role of permanent advocates, navigating a complex legal and media landscape. The family had to legally declare her deceased to manage her estate. This legal maneuver provided practical resolution but offered no emotional closure. The financial burden of maintaining private searches depleted their resources. The tragedy reshaped the trajectory of multiple generations. The broader consequence extended to the community's perception of safety. The event shattered the illusion of rural security, altering local behavior. Parents instituted strict curfews and forbade children from riding bicycles alone on the highway. The local police department faced enduring criticism for their initial handling of the crime scene. The legacy of the botched early hours haunted the agency for decades. The unresolved status left a permanent scar on the town's collective memory. Patty Dowell, Tara's mother, channeled her grief into a relentless decades-long campaign. She transformed her living room into one of several unofficial command centers for the Calico case. Stacks of heavily redacted police reports covered the dining table. She mapped every known sighting across the state using pushpins and yarn. The toll of this daily immersion was severe and unrelenting. Her physical health deteriorated rapidly as she pursued every distant rumor of her daughter's fate. She refused to let the investigation fade into obscurity. Patty refused to leave the house without ensuring someone was there to answer the landline. A single missed call could mean a missed tip from a crucial witness. She legally kept Tara's bank accounts active for years after the investigation stalled. She firmly believed Tara might escape captivity and need immediate funds to survive. This unwavering vigilance isolated her from friends who gently urged her to move forward. The search became an all-consuming vigil that defined the rest of her life. She sacrificed her own peace for the slim chance of a reunion. The epicenter of this enduring trauma remained the small desert community of Belen. The local residents struggled to reconcile their quiet agricultural reputation with the reality of an unsolved crime. Life in this rural enclave slowly returned to its normal rhythms, but a quiet suspicion lingered among the locals. The vast open spaces surrounding the town center offered far too many places to hide dark secrets related to the cold investigation. Every abandoned barn and dry riverbed became a source of underlying anxiety. Belen sits in the Rio Grande Valley, completely surrounded by harsh, unforgiving terrain. To the east, the Manzano Mountains create a towering natural barrier of rock and pine. To the west, arid mesas stretch for miles under a punishing daytime sun. The town itself is a grid of modest homes, local businesses, and agricultural supply stores. A major railway cuts directly through the municipality. The constant rumble of heavy freight trains provides a steady, vibrating background noise to daily life. Highway 47 runs straight through this landscape, acting as a vital artery for daily commuters and long-haul truckers. The shoulders of the road are composed of loose gravel, dirt, and discarded debris. Scrub brush and barbed wire fencing mark the boundaries of massive private ranches. Visibility stretches for miles in every direction under the clear desert sky. Yet, this wide-open geography paradoxically makes it incredibly easy for a vehicle to vanish quickly. A driver can easily turn onto one of the hundreds of unpaved, unmarked access roads. Coordinating a comprehensive search across the vast expanse of New Mexico required a massive logistical effort. The state's sheer size presented an immediate challenge to local authorities. State law enforcement agencies had to divide the rural counties into manageable search sectors. They established temporary communication relays to connect isolated deputies back to Central Command. The uneven terrain constantly threatened to disrupt radio signals. The New Mexico State Police deployed specialized mounted units to navigate the rugged terrain. Officers on horseback could traverse steep arroyos and narrow canyons completely inaccessible to standard patrol cruisers. Aviation units flew rigid grid patterns over the desert environment. Pilots used high-powered binoculars to scan for any anomalies hidden in the dense sagebrush. Ground teams walked shoulder to shoulder through the agricultural fields bordering the highway. They carried long metal probes to check the soft soil for any recent unnatural disturbances. Evidence collection in these remote areas followed strict, uncompromising protocols. If a searcher found an item, they marked the GPS coordinates and immediately halted the line. Forensic technicians would then photograph the object in its exact resting place before touching it. They measured its precise distance from the main road using standardized surveying equipment. This meticulous documentation was essential for mapping potential movement patterns of a suspect. Investigators needed to know exactly how far any physical clues strayed from the original bicycle route. The investigative limitations of 1988 severely hampered these early recovery efforts. Technology had not yet caught up to the urgent needs of missing persons cases. Without cellular networks, field teams relied on highly unreliable radio frequencies to report their findings. Significant delays occurred simply because deputies had to drive miles back to town to find a working telephone. Information moved slowly, costing investigators precious hours. For the families waiting at home, the analog reality of 1988 was agonizing. Information moved strictly at the speed of print media and physical mail. The Calico family spent thousands of dollars printing paper flyers at local copy shops. Volunteers taped these black and white posters to gas station windows and telephone poles across the county. Every faded photo on a flyer became a physical reminder of the unresolved crisis. The slow pace of communication amplified their deep feelings of helplessness. They were trapped in a frustrating information vacuum. Watching the evening news became a daily ritual of dread and eventual disappointment. The family sat by the television, desperately hoping for a national broadcast to pick up the story. When the local anchors moved on to other news, the silence felt like a profound abandonment. The lack of instant updates left a void, long before a mysterious Polaroid would shift the entire investigation out of state. Neighbors whispered baseless theories at the grocery store, creating a toxic atmosphere of suspicion. The analog era forced the family to endure the waiting process in agonizing slow motion. The physical evidence of the disappearance remained frustratingly sparse along that lonely stretch of highway. The initial crime scene offered very few concrete answers. Investigators repeatedly returned to the exact spot where the trail ultimately went cold. They hoped a subtle change in weather or lighting might reveal something previously overlooked by the initial search teams. The environment itself seemed to guard its secrets. The site where Tara's bicycle was eventually found offered a stark, desolate scene. It was located down a steep dirt embankment completely hidden from the view of passing motorists. The ground here was a rough mixture of hardened red clay and broken glass. Desert weeds grew aggressively through discarded tires and rusted metal debris. The location felt deliberately chosen for its absolute lack of visibility. A person could stand at the bottom of the incline and remain entirely unseen from the elevated road above. Tire tracks near the embankment suggested a sudden, aggressive vehicular maneuver. The heavy impressions in the dirt indicated a heavy truck or van accelerating rapidly off the shoulder. Pieces of a broken Walkman cassette player lay scattered in the dust, baking in the intense afternoon heat. The silence of the desert reclaimed the space almost immediately after the event. High winds continuously swept loose sand over the area, threatening to permanently erase the fragile tire impressions. The environment itself seemed actively hostile to preserving the objective truth of that morning. The Polaroid camera system relies on instant chemical processing, locking visual data into a distinct physical artifact. Forensic analysts understand that this specific film stock contains embedded manufacturing codes. These microscopic numbers dictate exactly when the photographic paper was produced at the factory. It establishes a hard chronological baseline for any subsequent investigation. The film itself acts as an unalterable witness to time. The chemical layers within the instant film also degrade in predictable, measurable ways. Experts can track the oxidation and color shifting of the synthetic dyes over time. This specific degradation rate helps determine how long a photograph has been exposed to direct sunlight or humidity. It turns the physical photograph into a rudimentary chemical clock. Investigators use this clock to narrow down the exact window of exposure. Investigators at the FBI laboratory in Washington received the original photograph in a sealed, climate-controlled evidence bag. They immediately placed the artifact under high-powered optical magnification. The technical analysts searched for microscopic identifying marks pressed into the white border. They carefully documented and cross-referenced the serial numbers printed on the back with Polaroid corporate manufacturing records. Every physical millimeter of the item was cataloged. The manufacturer confirmed the film was a highly specific type of instant color stock. Corporate logs proved it had been available for commercial purchase only since May of 1989. This definitive date became a critical forensic anchor for the entire investigation. It proved the disturbing image was captured at least 8 months after the initial disappearance in Belen. The timeline was permanently altered by this single fact. The authentication of the photo triggered a massive jurisdictional shift. Local law enforcement in New Mexico suddenly had to coordinate daily operations with authorities in Port St. Joe, Florida. The immense geographic distance strained the limited financial resources of the Belen Police Department. The investigation fractured across 2 entirely different states. Detectives found themselves navigating unfamiliar legal territories and competing departmental protocols. Federal agencies officially stepped in to manage the rapidly expanding scope of the inquiry. The FBI established dedicated task forces in both the Southwest and the Southeast regions. This sudden expansion created immediate logistical bottlenecks. Information sharing between the rural municipal departments and federal agents became slow and highly fragmented. Critical details were occasionally delayed in the bureaucratic transfer of physical case files. Patty Doyle sat in her quiet living room, staring endlessly at a high-resolution reproduction of the image. The agonizing ambiguity of the picture tore at her every single day. She scrutinized the bound girl's face for hours on end. She desperately looked for the familiar cowlick in the hair. The psychological weight of not knowing the truth was entirely suffocating. She noticed a faint mark on the girl's leg that perfectly mirrored a scar her daughter had. She also recognized a copy of a V.C. Andrews novel sitting next to the bound girl. It was her daughter's absolute favorite author. The horrifying possibility that her child was currently alive and suffering consumed her completely. It was a unique kind of ongoing, unresolved grief. The unsolved status of the investigation hung heavily over the entire community. The initial surge of national media attention eventually began to recede from the daily headlines. Network reporters packed up their heavy broadcast cameras and left the small desert town. The silence that followed their departure was deafening. The community was left alone to process the lingering trauma. Local detectives found themselves staring blankly at the same exhausted leads. The Florida connection had generated intense, immediate hope, but it yielded no physical suspects. The investigative trail connecting central New Mexico to the Gulf Coast remained entirely theoretical. The relentless momentum of the early days evaporated into a deeply frustrating standstill. The energy of the search simply ran out. The incident room at the Belen Police Department slowly transformed into a physical archive of failure. Stacks of thick manila folders covered every available desk surface. Dust gathered on the edges of the cardboard evidence boxes stacked precariously against the back wall. The air in the windowless room always felt stagnant and heavy. It was a space defined by absence. Faded topographical maps of Valencia County remained pinned tightly to the corkboards. Red string connected isolated geographic locations that no longer held any active significance. The glaring fluorescent lights illuminated thousands of pages of typed contradictory witness statements. The cramped room became a physical, bureaucratic monument to the missing girl. It stood as a daily reminder of their collective failure. A cold case fundamentally alters how law enforcement allocates its daily operational resources. Active uniform patrols no longer prioritize searching the grid for the missing person. Instead, the physical file is moved into a specialized long-term tracking system. It waits passively for new external inputs rather than generating fresh internal leads. The structural priority shifts from active hunting to passive monitoring. The National Crime Information Center database maintains the core data points of the dormant investigation. This digital system constantly runs in the background of every routine police traffic stop nationwide. It relies entirely on statistical probability and random chance encounters. The nationwide system requires an outside trigger, like a matching fingerprint or an alias, to reactivate the local investigation. Detectives instituted a mandatory periodic review of the central master file. Every 6 months, a newly assigned investigator would read the entire chronological log from the very beginning. They actively searched for subtle inconsistencies in the original, handwritten witness statements. They cross-referenced old vehicle license plate numbers with newly updated state motor vehicle registries. They looked for anything previously missed. Investigators also processed a slow but steady trickle of civilian tips. Each incoming phone call required a highly standardized intake form. Detectives had to independently verify the caller's identity and evaluate the baseline credibility of the provided information. Most of these tips were officially cleared and filed away within 48 hours. The process was meticulous, repetitive, and rarely fruitful. The stagnant case file left a permanent, invisible scar on the town's social fabric. Neighbors began to view each other with quiet, lingering suspicion in the grocery store aisles. The complete lack of an official resolution allowed dark, unsubstantiated rumors to flourish in the local diners. Trust within the tight-knit community fractured irreparably. The town fundamentally changed its internal dynamics. Longtime residents abruptly stopped letting their teenagers ride bicycles alone on the rural highways. The psychological boundary of the town contracted severely inward. The open desert was no longer viewed as a place of boundless freedom. It was now recognized as a vast, unforgiving landscape that could swallow a person whole. The landscape itself became a source of underlying dread. The Calico family bore the heaviest emotional burden as the official case file gathered dust in the police archives. Patty Dole, the missing woman's mother, refused to let the investigation fade into obscurity. She transformed her grief into a relentless, exhausting campaign for answers. Her daily routine became entirely consumed by the search, leaving no room for a normal life. Every unanswered phone call and dead-end lead compounded her daily torment. She meticulously tracked every rumor, organizing her own extensive files when the police had nothing new to offer. The lack of closure was not just a lingering sadness. It was an active, agonizing wound that reopened every time the telephone rang, bringing false hope followed by crushing disappointment. The mystery no longer solely revolved around a missing bicycle, as public attention centers on the broader implications of the stalled search. The narrative was shifting rapidly away from the immediate physical evidence. What began as a localized effort was transforming into a national spectacle. The story demanded a wider audience, moving beyond the boundaries of the local police jurisdiction. National media outlets began to view the situation not just as a local tragedy, but as a symbol of systemic investigative limitations. Producers and journalists recognized the compelling nature of a young woman vanishing without a trace. They began dispatching crews to New Mexico, fundamentally altering the scale of the inquiry. The small town was about to be thrust under a harsh, unforgiving spotlight. The physical centers of the investigation shifted from the dusty roads of New Mexico to fluorescent-lit television studios across the country. Command posts were set up in temporary hotel rooms by visiting journalists. These cramped spaces were filled with heavy broadcast equipment, tangled cables, and the constant hum of cooling fans. The quiet isolation of the high desert was entirely replaced by manufactured chaos. Bulletin boards in these makeshift media hubs were plastered with topographical maps of Valencia County. Timelines of that September morning were scrawled across whiteboards in thick black marker. Empty coffee cups and scattered press releases covered every available surface. The environment was frantic, driven entirely by strict broadcast deadlines rather than the methodical pacing of a traditional police inquiry. Keeping Tara in the public eye required a highly coordinated media strategy. The family and their supporters had to quickly learn the complex mechanics of national broadcasting. They needed to understand exactly how to package their tragedy for mass consumption. This meant scheduling back-to-back interviews, preparing concise statements, and navigating the relentless demands of network television producers. The process of national syndication meant missing person flyers were no longer just stapled to local telephone poles. They were digitized, transmitted over wire services, and broadcast into millions of living rooms simultaneously. This system relied on high-frequency repetition to lodge the victim's face into the collective memory of the public. The goal was to generate a critical mass of awareness that might shake loose a single vital clue. Law enforcement agencies had to adapt to the sudden influx of national attention regarding the investigation. A dedicated task force was established specifically to manage the sheer volume of incoming data generated by these television broadcasts. Detectives found themselves overwhelmed by thousands of calls pouring in from across the country. Each tip, no matter how unlikely, required formal documentation and assessment. Detectives implemented a strict triage system to efficiently categorize these new tips. They sorted leads based on geographic proximity to the disappearance and the caller's verifiable relationship to the family. High-priority leads were assigned immediately to field agents for in-person interviews. Low-priority calls were logged into a rapidly growing database, cross-referenced for recurring patterns, and then systematically cleared. This intense scrutiny placed immense pressure on the Calico family dynamic, fracturing their sense of normalcy. Relatives found themselves constantly analyzing their own memories of that weekend, searching for missed warnings. They began second-guessing every minor interaction they had prior to the disappearance. The relentless spotlight forced them to relive the initial trauma daily, stripping away any semblance of a quiet, private existence. The sheer volume of false leads generated by the national broadcasts created a devastating cycle of hope and despair. The family would receive a promising update from investigators, only to have it debunked days later. This continuous emotional whiplash severely degraded their mental well-being. They were trapped in a state of suspended animation, unable to grieve properly and unable to move forward. Patty Duell began to suffer severe physical symptoms from the crushing weight of the unresolved investigation. Sleep became nearly impossible, replaced by agonizing hours staring at old photographs. She spent her nights rereading witness statements, desperately hunting for a detail the police might have missed. The exhaustion was absolute, hollowing out her physical strength while sharpening her obsessive focus. Her relentless drive to find her daughter alienated some friends who simply did not know how to comfort her. People began to avoid her in public, unable to face the raw intensity of her pain. The grief was not a fading echo, but an active daily presence that consumed her entire existence. She became an island of sorrow, isolated by a tragedy that no one else could fully comprehend. While the family endured this highly public nightmare, the town of Belen attempted to navigate its own altered reality. The community was caught between supporting a grieving mother and trying to reclaim the quiet identity they once held. The national media presence eventually faded, packing up their cameras and moving on to the next major story. But the town was left to grapple with the permanent scars left behind. The departure of the news van signaled a shift from acute crisis to chronic, enduring uncertainty. The frantic energy of the initial search dissolved into a heavy, oppressive silence that settled over the streets. Residents had to return to their daily routines, but the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. The landscape itself felt different, permanently tainted by the unresolved question that still hung over the entire community. Belen itself felt visibly altered by the prolonged exposure to tragedy. Faded yellow ribbons remained tightly tied around the thick trunks of old cottonwood trees. Their frayed edges blew relentlessly in the dry desert wind, gathering layers of fine sand. These ribbons, once bright symbols of active hope, slowly transformed into weathered markers of a completely stagnant investigation. Main Street storefronts still displayed worn, missing posters in their glass windows. The ink on these flyers had been bleached blue by months of exposure to the harsh, direct sun. The edges of the paper were curled and brittle, peeling away from the glass. The physical landscape of the town served as a permanent, silent memorial to a mystery that simply refused to end. The jurisdiction of New Mexico law enforcement ended sharply at the state lines, creating a massive logistical hurdle. When a missing persons case crosses state borders, local deputies lose their primary investigative authority. They cannot execute search warrants or compel witness testimony in other jurisdictions. This legal boundary forces a complex handover of power. To bridge this gap, the system relies on federal intervention. The Federal Bureau of Investigation must officially open an interstate kidnapping file to mobilize resources outside the local county. This mechanism shifts control from the original investigators to a vast bureaucratic network of field offices. The local department becomes just one node in a national data sharing grid. The Valencia County Sheriff's Office had to formally request this federal assistance. Detectives compiled their initial field reports, witness statements, and the recovered bicycle fragments into a standardized transfer dossier. This paperwork was then routed through the state capitol in Santa Fe before reaching federal desks. Every step required meticulous documentation to maintain the chain of custody. Once federal agents assumed a coordination role, Communication protocols became strictly regulated. Daily briefings were replaced by scheduled teletype transmissions between regional offices. Local deputies in Belen were no longer permitted to directly contact out-of-state witnesses or police departments. They had to submit formal inquiries through the federal liaison, adding days to every investigative action. The analog reality of 1988 meant that sharing crucial evidence required physical mail and slow facsimile machines. This technological constraint severely delayed critical breakthroughs across state lines. High-resolution copies of evidence could not be transmitted instantly. Investigators had to wait for couriers to transport physical documents across the country. This delay allowed false leads to multiply rapidly. Without instant digital verification, every tip generated by out-of-state sightings took weeks to manually verify and dismiss. Field agents spent hundreds of hours tracking down dead ends based on blurry fax transmissions. The sheer volume of delayed paperwork began to bury the core facts of the case. For Tara's mother, Patty Doyle, this bureaucratic slowdown was agonizing. She spent her days waiting by the telephone for updates that rarely came. The physical distance between her home and the federal agencies handling the leads created a deep sense of isolation. She felt entirely sidelined by the very system designed to find her daughter. The psychological burden of knowing evidence existed elsewhere while being unable to act on it locally was crushing. Her home transformed into a makeshift command center filled with legal pads and long-distance phone bills. She relentlessly called federal offices, desperate to push the investigation forward. The silence from the authorities felt like a secondary betrayal. The focus of the disappearance shifted entirely away from the actual location where Tara vanished. Federal attention pivoted toward the distant coastal towns where new evidence was surfacing. The desert highway in Belen was no longer considered the primary theater of investigation. The search had definitively moved from a local physical landscape to a national paper trail. This shift left the original crime scene largely abandoned by outside experts. Local deputies were left to retrace the same empty miles of asphalt without new directives. The initial momentum of the ground search completely evaporated. The investigation became an abstract exercise in data management rather than a physical hunt. Months later, the physical state of the local search area had visibly degraded. The Rio Grande Valley brush had grown thick and dormant with the changing seasons obscuring the terrain. The dirt shoulders of Highway 47, where the bike tracks were initially discovered, were completely erased by seasonal rains. Heavy winter winds had scoured the desert floor clean. The physical trace of the crime was gone, replaced by the harsh, unchanging geography of the basin. Tumbleweeds piled up against the barbed wire fences lining the route. The deep arroyos, once meticulously combed by volunteers on horseback, were now filled with seasonal flood debris. The landscape had reclaimed its secrets, offering no further clues to anyone walking the route. The Polaroid itself entered a separate, highly classified ecosystem of forensic analysis. This marked a distinct phase shift from local ground searches to laboratory science. Federal technicians utilized specialized optical equipment to examine the physical properties of the image. The goal was to extract hidden data from the chemical layers of the film. Photographic analysis in that era relied on examining film grain, chemical composition, and light angles. Experts measured the shadows cast by the subjects to determine the time of day and geographic latitude. They scrutinized the background elements for regional flora or specific architectural details. Every millimeter of the image was subjected to rigorous scientific breakdown. Investigators contacted the Polaroid Corporation directly to trace the exact manufacturing batch of the film used. They provided the serial numbers printed on the back of the physical print to the company headquarters. Corporate archivists pulled the production logs for that specific chemical formulation. This record retrieval was a critical step in establishing a definitive timeline. The manufacturer confirmed the specific film type was not available for purchase until May 1989. This concrete measurement proved the image was taken at least 8 months after the initial abduction. The forensic report officially documented this chronological constraint. It was a rare, indisputable fact in a case built almost entirely on speculation. This single manufacturing detail regarding the photo destroyed any hope of a quick resolution. It meant the victims had been kept alive and transported over a long period. The realization forced law enforcement to completely discard their initial timeline of events. The parameters of the crime were vastly larger than anyone had initially calculated. The geographic scope of the investigation permanently expanded. The search was no longer about finding a local crime scene, but tracking a highly mobile operation across the American South. State and federal agencies had to coordinate a massive, ongoing surveillance effort. The case transformed into a complex, multi-year manhunt with no clear epicenter. The revelation that the victims were likely kept alive for months brought an agonizing new reality to Patty Doyle. As Tara's mother, she had spent the last year desperately hoping her daughter's suffering had been brief. Instead, the 1989 forensic timeline confirmed a prolonged ordeal. Every passing day meant Tara was out there, enduring an unimaginable captivity. The psychological toll on the family was absolute. Patty began keeping a bicycle in the living room, a silent monument to the morning her daughter vanished. She scoured thousands of tips that poured into the FBI headquarters. The weight of knowing Tara was likely transported across state lines left her family paralyzed by a vast, unsearchable map. Decades passed, and the official status of the investigation remained rigidly classified as unsolved. The initial surge of national media attention eventually faded, leaving behind boxes of unverified sightings and dead ends. Law enforcement agencies in New Mexico slowly scaled back their active task forces. The focus shifted from a frantic rescue mission to a grim historical review. Investigators periodically reopened the case files to apply new analytical techniques. They digitized thousands of paper records from the 1980s, hoping modern algorithms might detect a missed connection. Yet the core mystery resisted every technological advancement. The lack of a physical crime scene meant there was no DNA to sequence and no definitive forensic anchor to ground the theories. The evidence room in Valencia County now holds only fading remnants of that original synthesis. Cardboard boxes stack against the cinder block walls, containing decades of contradictory witness statements and faded composite sketches. Dust settles on the binders that once represented the most active manhunt in the region. The physical space reflects the stagnant nature of the investigation. Inside those boxes, the infamous photo sits preserved in an archival sleeve. The fluorescent lights of the precinct illuminate the severe degradation of the original paper. Time has slowly eroded the sharp edges of the image, mirroring the fading memories of the original investigators. The physical evidence is literally deteriorating, locked away in a climate-controlled silence. When a high-profile investigation officially turns cold, the entire bureaucratic apparatus changes its operational posture. The FBI reallocates its primary agents to active threats, leaving only a skeleton crew to monitor the historical tip line. A cold case is not closed, but it is fundamentally deprioritized. Funding for dedicated search teams simply evaporates from the annual budget. This administrative shift creates a permanent bottleneck for new information. If a citizen calls in a sighting today, the report enters a generalized database rather than triggering an immediate tactical response. Analysts must cross-reference the new data against thousands of pages of legacy files. The system is designed for preservation, no longer for rapid intervention. The systemic failures in tracking missing adults during the late 1980s forced a critical evaluation of law enforcement protocols. In the years following the disappearance, national databases for missing persons underwent massive structural overhauls. The National Crime Information Center mandated stricter guidelines for entering dental records and fingerprints. The goal was to ensure cross-state communication would never again rely on mailed bulletins. Local police departments completely rewrote their standard operating procedures for adult missing persons reports. The previous standard allowed a mandatory waiting period of 24 to 48 hours before an investigation could begin. That delay was officially eliminated in jurisdictions across the country. Officers are now required to treat sudden, uncharacteristic disappearances as immediate critical incidents. These procedural upgrades fundamentally altered how the justice system responds to sudden vanishings. A modern task force can now distribute digital alerts across state lines within minutes of a confirmed abduction. The localized communication breakdown that plagued the original investigators has been engineered out of the system. The tragedy catalyzed a permanent shift in interstate law enforcement capabilities. However, these modern advancements arrived far too late to benefit the Calico family. The permanent legacy of the case is a paradox of improved national safety built on an unresolved personal tragedy. The community of Belen remains marked by the failure of the old system. The town became a permanent symbol of the era's investigative limitations. Patty Dole spent the remainder of her life trapped in an agonizing state of suspended grief. She moved away from New Mexico, relocating to Florida in a desperate attempt to escape the constant reminders of her daughter's absence. Yet she kept a dedicated phone line active for decades, waiting for a call that never came. She died in 2006 without ever knowing the truth. The emotional devastation radiated outward, affecting the investigators who had dedicated their careers to the search. Retired detectives still keep copies of the case files in their homes, haunted by the feeling that a crucial clue was overlooked. The unresolved nature of the crime leaves a permanent psychological scar. There is no closure, only a heavy, enduring silence. The cultural aftershock of the mystery fundamentally changed how the public interacts with missing persons cases. The infamous Polaroid became one of the first viral true crime artifacts long before the advent of the Internet. It demonstrated how a single piece of visual evidence could bypass local authorities and capture the global imagination. The public realized they could actively participate in the search. This shift in public engagement birthed a new era of amateur sleuthing. Citizens began independently analyzing unsolved cases, forming networks to share theories and dissect evidence. The intense global focus on that single photograph proved that geographic boundaries no longer limited an investigation. It established a precedent for crowdsourced justice that continues to define modern true crime culture. Today, the vast desert surrounding State Road 47 remains a quiet, desolate landscape. The wind sweeps across the scrub brush and the cracked asphalt, just as it did on that September morning in 1988. Beneath the vast expanse of the sky, the physical environment holds its secrets tightly. The landscape itself feels like an accomplice to the crime. The central question still echoes through this empty terrain. Who exactly was driving the light-colored Ford pickup truck that multiple witnesses saw trailing behind the bicycle? Despite international attention and decades of technological advancement, the identity of the driver remains completely unknown. The investigation centers entirely around that phantom vehicle, a ghost that vanished into the desert sun. The failure to identify the phantom truck exposed a fundamental flaw in jurisdictional communication. Law enforcement databases in the late 1980s operated in strictly isolated silos. A sheriff's department in one county had no automated method to share vehicle descriptions with state police just 50 miles away. This structural bottleneck meant critical sightings often languished in paper files. The intense scrutiny placed on the Calico case became a primary catalyst for dismantling these silos. It forced New Mexico authorities to mandate regional data sharing protocols for missing persons. The glaring gaps in the initial search grid proved that isolated police departments could not handle highly mobile suspects. This realization fundamentally changed how state agencies coordinate multi-county alerts. For the investigators who originally walked those desert highways, the lack of resolution left a permanent mark. Many retired detectives refused to surrender the case upon leaving the force. They kept photocopies of the evidence files, witness statements, and grid maps stacked in their own private homes. The investigation transitioned from a professional duty to a lifelong personal obligation. These former officers routinely cross-referenced new missing persons reports against their faded notes on their own time. They paid out of pocket to travel across state lines, chasing down vague tips about the Florida photograph. The burden of the unsolved disappearance anchored them to 1988. Their retirement years were consumed by the desperate need to find that one overlooked detail. This localized, obsessive dedication eventually influenced how state authorities allocate resources for cold cases. Bureaucrats recognized that relying on the unpaid labor of retired officers was an unsustainable strategy. Funding structures shifted to support dedicated task forces that specifically revisit stalled investigations. New budgets were established to ensure older cases received continuous, funded attention. The realization that physical evidence degrades over time forced a massive reallocation of these state budgets. Modern forensic teams now receive proactive funding to digitize analog records before they disintegrate completely. The fragile nature of the original witness tapes from Belen served as a direct warning. Preserving the chain of custody now requires immediate digital archiving of all historical materials. Yet all this structural progress cannot answer the most agonizing variable of that September morning. It remains entirely unknown if the young woman in the Polaroid ever saw her family searching for her. The photograph suggests a period of captivity, opening a dark window into prolonged suffering. That specific uncertainty prevents any true psychological closure for those who loved her. The possibility that she survived for months or even years creates a localized grief that time cannot dilute. Families of missing persons often speak of the torture of ambiguous loss. Without a physical location to mourn, the mind constantly generates horrifying scenarios of what might have happened. The silence from the desert offers no comfort, only an endless void of possibilities. The enduring legacy of this specific uncertainty reshaped missing persons advocacy on a national scale. Advocacy groups leveraged the intense media focus on the anomalous photograph to demand stricter federal guidelines. They argued that the crucial early hours of an investigation were routinely wasted by outdated policies. The public outrage generated by the image provided the necessary leverage for legislative reform. These new guidelines effectively eliminated mandatory waiting periods for adult missing persons reports. Law enforcement agencies were compelled to take immediate action, treating every unexplained absence as a potential crisis. The procedural hesitation that plagued the initial hours of the 1988 search was formally abolished. The tragedy directly resulted in a faster, more aggressive institutional response protocol. Back in Belen, the physical reminders of that early procedural hesitation still dot the community. Faded yellow ribbons tied to oak trees decades ago have long since turned gray and brittle. The harsh New Mexico sun has bleached the missing posters taped inside local diner windows. These decaying markers serve as quiet monuments in a town that otherwise continued to grow. The local community center still maintains a small bulletin board dedicated exclusively to her memory. It stands in the corner of the room, gathering dust beneath a layer of protective glass. Residents walk past it daily, their eyes skipping over the familiar face frozen in time. The physical environment absorbs the trauma, weaving the loss into the everyday architecture of the town. This localized memory intersects with a broader shift in how the public consumes media regarding unsolved disappearances. The endless speculation surrounding the Florida photograph altered the fundamental relationship between law enforcement and media networks. Police departments realized that releasing highly anomalous evidence to a global audience carried massive risks. A single compelling image could easily derail a localized investigation. Today, agencies actively manage the release of visual evidence to prevent mass public misinterpretation. They understand that crowdsourced investigations often generate a flood of well-meaning but entirely useless tips. The signal-to-noise ratio becomes unmanageable when millions of people analyze the same photograph. The Belen case taught authorities to tightly control what the public sees. The management of that specific Polaroid still frustrates forensic analysts who study the original film. They cannot definitively prove the origin of the copy of the book lying next to the bound girl. The spine of the book contains what appears to be a handwritten phone number. Tracing the exact printing batch of that novel yielded completely contradictory results. The physical evidence within the frame remains stubbornly ambiguous, defying modern enhancement techniques. Analysts have repeatedly scanned the image using advanced algorithms to separate the film layers. They attempt to isolate the reflection in the camera lens visible in the background. Despite these meticulous digital reconstructions, the environment inside the van remains a blurry, unreadable mess. This persistent ambiguity ultimately forced the FBI to refine its protocols for analyzing found media. The agency established specialized units dedicated entirely to authenticating and tracing analog photographs. These divisions were built to handle the exact type of visual puzzle presented in the parking lot. They developed new standardized methods for calculating spatial dimensions from two-dimensional prints. These units now utilize advanced photogrammetry and chemical analysis that did not exist during the initial investigation. They can determine the exact make and model of a camera based purely on the light distortion at the edges of a photo. The agonizing limitations of the 1988 inquiry exposed critical blind spots in forensic science. Those early failures directly built the foundation for today's visual forensic standards. Today, the original Polaroid sits in a climate-controlled evidence vault, its colors slowly fading into history. but out on the sun-baked shoulder of Highway 47, where a 19-year-old girl took her final morning ride. The desert wind still blows across an empty road, leaving behind a silence that no forensic science can ever fill.